This is a story of survival, a desperate escape, and the haunting memory of a day that should have been just another innocent school field trip. So listen closely and imagine yourself in the back seat of that car, wondering if you'll ever make it out alive. In 7th grade, we went on an end-of-the-year field trip to a nearby aquarium called Ocean Kingdom. We lived in Highland Dawn, a literal mountain town with nothing but hills and mountains as far as the eye could see. Our science teacher, Mr. Jasper Hale, was our chaperone for the trip. He was a very laid-back teacher, so while the other chaperones were more uptight and strict with their groups, Mr. Hale was much more relaxed about his responsibilities. That might sound like a good thing, but because of his laid-back approach to supervision, my friend Maxwell Reed and I were able to easily slip away from the aquarium lobby and the rest of the groups. We simply didn't want to wait around for all the groups to move through the exhibits. Since the whole aquarium was empty except for our classes, when Maxwell and I walked through the passageways, or observation areas, as you could call them, before everyone else, we didn't see anyone around. We had the best views of all the large fish tanks and habitats. We continued to the next dark room, all of which were illuminated with a blue tint from the fish tanks. This room had many big tanks filled with tropical fish. We were joking around about finding Nemo fish, like clownfish and Dory, when I distinctly remember someone calling out to us in a very assertive, commanding voice. It was a man wearing cargo shorts and a green t-shirt, and he asked if we were part of the field trip. I was about to shake my head no, but Maxwell answered yes. The man immediately told us to come with him. Assuming he worked for the aquarium, we followed him. However, instead of leading us back to the lobby, he guided us through some narrow, dark hallways. I remember passing the bathrooms and seeing a few exit signs hanging from the ceiling before reaching an exit door. He led us outside to a back area near the woods. At this point, I finally asked if he worked there and where he was taking us. He confirmed that he did work there and said he needed to drive us around to the front of the aquarium to let us back in. It didn't make much sense back then, just as it doesn't now. It makes sense now, but back then we were just nervous 7th graders who thought we were about to get into serious trouble. So when he led us to his car, we willingly got into the back seats. He told us to strap in, and he pulled out from the back parking lot onto the street. Just as we thought he was going to make a right turn towards the front of the aquarium, he immediately turned left. Both Aiden and I asked him at the same time where he was going, but he didn't answer. About 5 seconds later, we heard the locks on the back doors click down, and he made some kind of threat. Something like, "If either of you try to make any moves, I'll kill you." He then proceeded to slide out what appeared to be a big knife from his glove box as a threat. Aiden and I sat in silence. I'm sure he wanted to throw up just like I did. We knew we had to think of a way to escape, but we couldn't communicate with each other because the man kept looking in the rearview mirror every few seconds. He was driving us uphill through some isolated, wooded neighborhood until he finally pulled over onto the side of the road, which seemed to be in the middle of nowhere. No houses, no traffic, nothing. He told us to stay in the car as he got out, holding his knife in his hand. I whispered to Aiden to be ready to run. Just as I said that, the man came to my door, popped it open, and told me to step out. He instructed me to tell my friend that if he wanted me alive, he better stay in the car until we returned. I felt a sinking feeling in my stomach as he said that. The man started walking me towards the woods, probably with the knife in his pocket, intending to do who knows what. Do God knows what. I saw Aiden sliding over to my side of the car, which had an unlocked door, and when he seemed ready to run, I screamed, "Run!" Aiden was already sprinting downhill, and I quickly dodged the man, fleeing past him to follow Aiden. The man tried chasing us on foot, and I'm not exaggerating when I say he threw the knife at me. He missed by only a few inches. I heard the clanging of the knife hitting the ground ahead of me, but I didn't stop to pick it up. I just kept running downhill, back in the direction we had come from. The man stopped following us after throwing the knife. I think he got back into his car and fled the scene. Somehow, he managed to make it back to the aquarium in under an hour, and we also managed to sneak back into our group. Mr. Jasper Hale didn't even notice we were gone. Aiden and I decided to keep quiet about what happened. What purpose would it serve to get ourselves in trouble, especially since there was relatively no chance of that man getting caught? As we got older, we started to wonder more and more about what the man's intentions were. We could obviously think of a few likely possibilities, but either way, we kept quiet about it and prefer not to think about it. When I was in 8th grade, all of my classmates and I looked forward to our Washington, D.C. field trip. The thrill of going on any sort of trip with friends was enough to excite us. After all the preparations, we were ready for D.C. Once we arrived at our destination, my class of around 100 students was split into 3 groups, and within these groups where each group was sent off in different coach buses, and we would be taken to various attractions throughout D.C., neighboring states, monuments, parks, food stops, museums, and more. After a long weekend of visiting educational sites, our teachers decided to treat us to a colonial ghost tour one night. It was an evening walking tour through some of America's historical sites, near village cemeteries and old townhomes. I don't remember exactly which city we were in, but I do remember the guides telling us that many of the empty homes were preserved due to their historical significance. I've always been scared of most things related to ghosts and the supernatural, but I was certain that nothing would happen during our ghost tour. We split into smaller groups of around 10 members each and were encouraged to carry cameras if we wished. The guide kept reminding us not to expect much from the tour and assured us that there would likely be nothing supernatural occurring that evening. As we wandered from colonial home to cemetery plot and back to another colonial home, I found myself interested in the histories the guides would share about each location. They indulged us with stories about each homeowner, while my friends snapped photo after photo, hoping to capture a shiny orb or some paranormal evidence. One of my friends, Caleb Brooks, who I shared a room with during the trip, wasn't one of those kids who were constantly taking pictures. She would take a photo every once in a while, but spent most of the time listening to the stories, just like I did. Our group eventually reached a small 2-story home in the middle of the street. The house had an ominous blue hue to the windows, but the house was vacant. I remember feeling a deep curiosity about this particular home. The tour guide began to share its story, mentioning that it had originally belonged to a man and his beautiful wife. The man adored his wife, and the couple was thrilled when they learned they were expecting a child. Sadly, the wife died shortly after giving birth to a baby girl. The man was devastated by the loss and grew to resent his daughter as she grew up. During her childhood, he kept her in the house as much as possible, constantly reminding her of how plain and homely she looked. Unable to find a suitor for her, and feeling that she served no other purpose, he had his daughter learn to sew and weave upstairs, using what he considered her only good attribute, her hands. After hearing this story, I remember feeling a deep sorrow for this girl. She and her father must have lived miserably in that house until their deaths. My friend Caleb Brooks, who was walking with me, took a photograph of the house, and we both continued on to the next location. But as we were walking, Caleb suddenly stopped and went silent, staring down at the screen of her digital camera. I walked over to see what had caught her attention, and that's when I saw it. A gleam coming from the edge of the second-floor window on the right side of the house. I asked Caleb to zoom in on the image, and after enlarging it, 3 figures became startlingly clear, staring out from the window. On the far right was the translucent outline of a woman, with a taller man standing just behind her. But what struck us the most was the third figure, appearing to be a woman, but her features were harder to make out. The body was there, unmistakably, but her skin was not as clearly visible as the other 2. Caleb and I freaked out instantly. The woman and man made sense to me. That would explain the man and his daughter. But who was this darker woman off to the side? I raised my hand and asked the guide, was there ever another person living with the family at the house we just looked at? The guide looked surprised at my question but answered, yeah, during the time of their residence, they had a black female servant living with them. During my senior year of high school, my forensics teacher, Mr. Grayson Cole, somehow convinced the school to let him take us on a field trip to an abandoned building in the woods, which had been the site of a major crime scene. I think he might have finessed it a bit and made. The school believed we would only be studying the perimeter and outside of the building, but we ended up doing much more than that. Mainly, it used to be a drug den. When we arrived, I realized just how frightening the building actually was. Its location was surreal, surrounded by forests in every direction. The only road leading up to it was one you would never think to drive down, considering the grass growing through the street. Since our class topic at the time was dealing with drugs, Mr. Grayson Cole led us inside the abandoned building. He gave a tour of the place as if he'd been there many times before and seemed to know quite a bit of history about it. For example, he mentioned that the actual original purpose of the building was unknown and that construction on the higher levels was never completed before the building was abandoned. Its secluded location and size made it an ideal place for drug deals and other illegal activities, which surprised all of us, considering we were inside what was once a former drug den. And this was a school field trip. Mr. Grayson Cole was so lax about the trip that he didn't even notice when a couple of students wandered off to explore on their own. Or maybe he just didn't care. Seeing that a few other students did it, my friend Leo Hunter and I decided to go off on our own too. And yes, I'm a guy who just so happens to have a really close friend who is a girl. Back then, in high school, there had to be at least 8 floors in this building. But from the outside, the top few floors looked unfinished. I basically forced Leo to come all the way upstairs with me to explore those top floors. Worst case scenario, if we couldn't find the group again, we'd just head back to the bus waiting right outside. We climbed the stairs one flight after another. It was strange. As we reached the middle floors, the amount of debris and graffiti decreased a bit. But then, as we continued to the higher floors, it seemed to increase again, even more than on the lower floors. That's when things got sketchy. It seemed like we were on the second highest floor, and everything around us was still just wood foundation. A lot of the wood seemed to be rotting, and there were quite a few holes in the floor. We would have gone up to the very top floor, but the stairs had been stripped and broken. Basically, there were no stairs left to reach that floor. There had to be some way up there, though, so we carefully watched our steps, making sure to avoid any weak wood as we navigated that floor. Then, Leo grabbed my shoulder and stopped me, pointing upward toward a hole in the ceiling. She said she saw something. And that's when we heard a ticking noise, the kind of noise someone makes when calling a cat, like a soft, tisk-tisk sound. Immediately after that, an arm came into view through the hole above us. It was just an arm, though, and judging by its position, whoever it belonged to must have been lying flat on the floor next to the hole. The person wore a long black sleeve, so only their hand was visible. Leo was scared, and although I laughed a little at first, I'm not going to pretend it didn't freak me out slightly unnerving. Leo Hunter started telling me, "Let's go back down." I called up to the person, "How do we get up there?" But they didn't answer. Instead, they just kept making the ticking noise and waving us up. That's when things got really creepy, and I agreed with Leo that we should head back down. Just as I said this, the person pulled their arm out from the hole, and we heard the sound of a shoe scraping quickly against the wood foundation above us, as if the person was getting up. But we couldn't see what was going on. I nudged Leo to move, feeling creeped out and wanting to get out of there. As we were about to leave the main open layout room and step back into the stairway corridor, we heard a crash far behind us. Turning around, we saw a man on the complete opposite side of the room, facing the wall, and it seemed like he had just jumped through one of the holes in the floor. Then, he quickly turned his head to look at us without moving his body. There was something unsettling about his face and clothing. He didn't look like the typical urban explorer. He looked dangerous and unstable. Leo and I ran for it, sprinting down one flight of stairs at a time. 3 flights down, I glanced up the long stairway corridor above us and saw the man standing at the top, looking down at me. I yelled, "Go!" to Leo, and we kept running down. About 5 flights later, I looked up again, and there he was, still looking down at me. But this time much closer. It hit me then. He was chasing us. We finally got to the bottom, and when I looked up one last time, I didn't see him anymore. Then we heard the voice of Mr. Grayson Cole nearby, and I kind of started to laugh about what had just happened. Not because it was funny, but more out of relief that we had made it back safely. Leo wasn't laughing, though. She was genuinely disturbed. We found Mr. Grayson Cole, who asked where we had been, and we told him the truth about what just happened. He was pretty mad at us for wandering off, but given what we had just told him, he also advised that we leave the building. The other students who had wandered off had already returned, and when we got to the bus, Mr. Grayson Cole did a head count 3 times to make sure everyone was there. Overall, the trip wasn't a failure for the rest of the class. The other kids learned things about the building and drugs. But for Leo and me, it was the most terrifying experience we'd ever gone through. In the end, We got back to school and tried to put the whole experience behind us. But even now, I can't help but wonder who that man was and why he was up there. And sometimes, late at night, I find myself thinking about that abandoned building, those eerie ticking sounds, and that creepy face looking down at us from the stairwell. It's a memory I'll never forget, a brush with danger that still sends chills down my spine. So, if you ever find yourself wandering through an old, abandoned place, be careful. You never know who might be watching from the shadows. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and comment on this video. And most importantly, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you never miss another spooky tale. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.